Folks are on time tonight.
It's great. Happy virtual homecoming for all our alumni out there.
And feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're calling in from.
Tell us your name and where you're calling from. And if you are an alum, what your class year was. Hey, Sydney. Hey, Clark. Hey, Hallie Hearn, Cuz, Molly, TJ, and Baldwin Harris. Oh, I've got some of my Mal's girls here and Marianne Parrott. Hey, Alicia. Sarah, it's good to see you. Mike Queen. What a great group of people. I wish we were all in the same room. My other cousin, Lori Furr Vancini. Ben and Susan Aycock. Hey, Rob, one of my favorite historians. Hey, Jimmy Broughton. Hey, Sandra on Faculty Drive.
We'll probably get started at 6:02. Sorry, Mary.
No, that's okay. Scott Danforth, my publisher, which I'm excited to tell you all more about that. And Beck Howell from Charlotte. Beck, I miss Charlotte too. And I'm also happy to be here. And the Tweedies, welcome. Okay, do you want to get started?
Yeah, well, you can go ahead and keep introducing yourself, and I'll just make a few opening remarks. Well, welcome everyone for Sally Wait, the behind the scenes story of how one woman shaped the founding of Wake Forest. I'm Sarah Solem, the manager of community and academic learning at the Wake Forest Historical Museum, and I'm so glad to be here today and have a chance to moderate what's sure to be a very fruitful discussion about Wake Forest history. This year, we're celebrating Wake Forest homecoming virtually, and I'm really glad that we're kicking off the week celebration with the story of Sally Wait, told by someone whose Wake Forest roots really, truly run deep. And I'll get to that in a minute. But before we begin, I want to just do a few housekeeping things. I want to direct you to the bottom toolbar on your screen, and you're going to see a few icons. Tonight, after Mary's presentation, we're going to have a Q&A, and we're going to use the chat feature. So you're going to see two chat bubbles overlaid on top of each other with the words Q&A under it. That, if you open that up, that's where we're going to type in questions. And as an added bonus tonight, you can upvote others' questions. So if someone asks a really awesome question and you're like, yes, I want that answered, go ahead and click on it, give it a thumbs up or a little up arrow, and that'll pop to the top. So I can see it and make sure that I give that one to Mary. Make sure it's a really hard one, right? We want to give her those hard ones. And then towards the right, you're going to see another chat bubble. And that's just the text box where everyone's been introducing themselves. So feel free to use that for general comments. You know, if Mary mentions a story or a source that you just think is neat and you want to say, very cool, go ahead and use that chat box. But if you have a question, please use the Q&A. Otherwise, I might miss it when I'm moderating. I think that that's everything. This program is going to be recorded. And so we'll send you a direct link to that once it's ready. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Mary Tribble. Mary Tribble graduated from Wake Forest University in 1982 with a degree in art history and completed her Master of Arts in Liberal Studies in 2019. She's a fifth generation Wake Forester, and she returned to her alma mater in 2014 to become Senior Advisor for Engagement Strategies, where she's responsible for creating meaningful experiences for the approximately 70,000 members of the alumni family. And she looks out for everyone over at the Wake Forest Historical Museum. She is also a member of the steering committee of the Slavery, Race, and Memory Project, an initiative that re-examines the university's history with regard to slavery and its legacies. In addition to all of that, she serves on the National Advisory Council at Rinalda House Museum of American Art, and she's recently restored a beautiful 1824 house in Old Salem. And prior to her return to Wake Forest to join the alumni team. She owned an event marketing firm in Charlotte for over 25 years, or for 25 years. And tonight's presentation is based on her upcoming book on the life of Sally, Merriam Wait. We're so excited that the book will be available for purchase in fall 2021. So please keep an eye out on the museum's social media pages, website, and the Wake Forest University alumni social media pages for information about pre-order when that's available. We're all so excited for that book to come out. And it was an extension of her MA program that she completed in 2019. So Mary, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're really excited to hear the stories you have to share with us tonight.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen and we will dive right in. So I am really thrilled to be here tonight and to share, if anybody knows me and knows, I've been working on my research with Sally Wait for a good about 3.5 years now. And I love to tell her story. And I started doing my research when I returned to Winston-Salem to work at Wake Forest. And I actually followed up on the research began with my mother about 20 some years ago. Another descendant of the Waits donated a barrel full of archives to ZSR Library. And my mother was very interested. So she came up and began translating or transcribing all the letters and kind of got me interested in it marginally. But it wasn't until I returned back on campus and decided to pursue my master's in liberal studies that I got really serious about doing the research. And I did it for 2 reasons. One, I thought it was important to bring a woman's voice to the founding of Wake Forest. And Sally Wait, if you've ever seen Pascal's history that was published in the 1930s, which is very, very detailed and very, very thorough. Sally has all of 3 citations in the entire book. So I knew that there was part of the story that needed to be told. And then the other reason I did it was just out of pure curiosity, because I really wanted to understand why a woman with a really relatively comfortable existence in Vermont would make her way down to the backcountry of North Carolina and end up helping found a college. So part of it was curiosity as well. So let's just dive right in, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we know about her. Her name is Sarah Merriam Wait, but she went by Sally. Everyone called her Sally. She called herself Sally, so that's what I call her as well. So she was born in Brandon, Vermont in 1794, and her father was a merchant farmer. So they basically lived on the family farm economy, and the whole family supported the family business. So Sally's father and her brothers would, farm the land, and her mother and her sister would then work on the weaving and the needle arts and so on. So it was a very they lived a comfortable existence. They were about a mile outside of the town border, and I wouldn't call them wealthy by any stretch. Her uncle, on the other hand, her mother's brother was John Conant, and he was a influential town elder. He was an entrepreneur with multiple businesses. He was the secretary of the Baptist Church and basically the funder of the Baptist Church for many, many years. And I would refer to him as being relatively wealthy compared to others in Brandon. So while the Wait family, again, didn't amass a lot of wealth, she and her family certainly had a certain amount of comfort and respect within the town itself. So what we know of Sally, we know from primarily from her journal, which you can see, this is the inside title page, and you can see that it reads Sally Merriam's Journal Continued, which is like a dagger to a researcher's heart, because that means there was another journal at some point, and unfortunately that has not survived. So, but we do have this one. And this is at the ZSR Library. And when I first started doing the research, this is where I started. And if you can see underneath her title, there's 4 lines from a poem that reads, "Soon fades the flowers, soon fleets the zephyr's breath. In the midst of life, we tread the verge of death." So I remember reading that for the first time and thinking, that is kind of a dark theme for a 20-year-old woman's journal. And I tried to figure out what it was. I actually thought maybe it was a part of a hymn because she quotes hymns all throughout. But no, it is actually part of a poem called The Year, written by a young man named William Lee Pierce. He published it in 1813, and he did not live too far away from where Sally lived. And it is a long, epic, very tedious poem that outlines just about everything that happened in the year 1812. And a lot of bad things happened in the year of 1812. As you know, we went to war with Great Britain. There was a terrible earthquake in Venezuela that was felt all the way up to the Ohio Valley, and many people were killed. There was this horrific fire in a theater in Richmond where all of the, fine townspeople were attending, including the governor, and the depictions of it almost look like, a 19th century version of 9/11 with people throwing themselves out the window, and the governor died and perished. And of course, there were plenty of epidemics happening as well. So William Lee Pierce published this poem, and there's a reason why he did. So as all of these things were going on, many of the evangelical preachers and churches at that time were what we call millennialists. So they assumed that shortly after the new millennium that end times were near, basically. And so what we can see, even in the Vermont Baptist Association circular letter in 1813, they're preaching from the pulpit that God's judgments are abroad in the earth, and the shaking tempest has now begun. So there's this sense of urgency that's happening in and around the area in general, in terms of concern that end times are near. So welcome to the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was in the mid-18th century. The Second Great Awakening began around this time, around the turn of the century up into, say, the 1830s. This is actually a painting of a Methodist preacher named Lorenzo Dow. You see he's at a camp meeting. You can see the tents in the background. And it's very indicative of Samuel Wait preached at a number of these kinds of camp meetings and revivals over the years as well. And as you can see, it's depicted as a very raw emotional experience with people just gesturing wildly, and people have fainted and they're crying and holding their heads. And so there was this, it was just all about this kind of emotional conversion that was sweeping up and down the Eastern Seaboard at this time. So that's kind of the context of what's going on that influenced Sally in thinking about how she was going to theme her journal and what she was going to attribute it to. On a more personal level, what happens with Sally is, so she's about 19 years old at this point. Well, in 1813, she was, I can't do the math, she was about 19 years old. And and what we've been able to put together from what she writes in her journal, and then also putting together what else was happening in Brandon at the time. As I said, there were epidemics that were sweeping around Brandon and the state of Vermont as well. And there was one very popular young girl. She was actually 16, a little bit younger than Sally, but she was friends in the same friend group with Sally. Their pews were actually next to each other in the church. And little Nabby Farrington succumbed to, I think it was a typhoid epidemic that was going on. And as I said, she was very popular. And what we can piece together from her journal and newspaper reports and other things is that Sally, on April 3rd, 1813, Sally attended Nabby Farrington's funeral. And it was that afternoon that she described as having her kind of emotional conversion. And she writes about it in her journal. And you can see this is next to it is a photograph of the church records. And around that time, written in there is that there appears an uncommon solemnity on the minds of youth, and some are hopefully converted. So Nabby's death had a big impact, not only on Sally, but other young people in town. So Sally did on this page, also from the church journal, it lists Sally's baptism as being in early June. But for the rest of her life, she actually called April 3rd her spiritual birthday, going back to the day of Nabby Farrington's funeral. So, and I think it's important to say too that conversion at that time was kind of a rite of passage. It was a coming of age, especially obviously for young people. And so even if a young person had grown up in an evangelical church, like the Baptist church, which Sally did, there tended to always be this coming of age, this time when you're going to set aside the frivolities of your youth and move to live a more sober life dedicated to God. So that indeed is what happened with Sally. Sally's journal, there's a character that appears in Sally's journal time and time again, and she writes about her actually throughout her life. And this woman is Anne Hasseltine Judson. So Anne Hasseltine Judson was the first missionary to Burma. And she and her husband, Adoniram Judson, went there, and they sailed in 1812. They became the first Baptist missionaries there. There's a longer backstory to it, but I don't have time to get into it. And once they settled there, they would write letters and write reports back to both the British and the American Baptists. And those letters were then published into religious tracts that were circulated throughout both Britain and America. And Sally read those letters breathlessly, and she wrote about them in her journal. And she became a heroine, not only to Sally, but to thousands of women across the country and in Britain. And Sally really wanted to pattern her life after Anne Judson and become a missionary. And so Sally looked to Anne as inspiration. And as I said, thousands of others did as well. The way I describe it is that to a 19th century Baptist, Anne and Adoniram Judson were like Beyonce and Jay-Z to us today. I mean, they were just, I mean, it was like you were reading about them in Tiger Beat, if anybody my age knows what that means. So also in Sally's journal, she begins, after she has her conversion, she begins thinking about what she's going to do in terms of following what her calling is. And at this time, she believes she wants to be a missionary. And you can see somewhere around her birthday, she's just, complaining to herself about how she has wasted 21 years of her life. And surely it's time to be about my master's business. So she wants to pursue this pious ambition of being a missionary. But in the time that she's living, because of the strictures and gender constraints, she also knows that she needs to do what Anne Judson did, which is find a suitable match who shares her pious ambitions as well. And as luck would have it, one shows up in the town of Brandon, Vermont, not long after her conversion. So this is Samuel Wait with his hair all spiffed up. And as you can see, he's a pretty pleasant looking young man. He shows up in Sally's town in Brandon. He's from a rural area not far away. He shows up to study with her minister, her Baptist minister. And so, I'm sure there's some matchmaking going on. Her brothers are also studying with that minister. So, they begin a courtship. The photograph on the left is actually the outside of Sally's journal. So Sally's journal it's not like a diary that she writes in and tucks under her mattress, and telling us her most private thoughts. It's a performative piece of work. In other words, it's actually the story of an evangelical courtship. It tells the story. It's got a story arc. It begins when they meet. It's about the middle way through, they become betrothed, and at the end, there's a resolution of a church scandal. And so she wrote this for an imagined reader, and we don't really know who that would be. I don't think she necessarily ever dreamed of it being published. I'm pretty certain that she definitely wanted her daughter to read it. and then perhaps her daughter's daughter and her daughter's daughter's daughter. And here I am, and now I'm about to publish a book about it. So I don't know that that's what she imagined, but she tells us what she wants us to know in this story arc. And there's evidence that she actually wrote all the pages down, and then she actually constructed the journal itself. So in the journal, she writes, so again, she wants us to know, she wants us to have the impression that she is this kind of humble, devoted Christian woman. And so because of that, she doesn't want us to believe that she's all giddy when she meets Samuel Wait. So in one of the first mentions, it actually takes her almost the entire journal before she ever even calls him Mr. W. She always has just a line, but for her first mention of him, she says, "A new and unexpected scene, but I don't feel much elated. I humbly hope that God will direct me in the path of wisdom, because without that, I shall probably not only destroy my own happiness for this life, but make those around me wretched and miserable." So, it wasn't like she, ran home and wrote breathlessly in her journal that she met this cute guy that wants to be a minister. And she depicts that ambiguity throughout their courtship, which takes about a little over 2 years. She kind of keeps rejecting them, and he keeps showing back up. So finally, after all of this time, she does admit to herself, again, with much ambiguity, about the fact that she never really uses the word love. She uses that she finds herself under the influence of a very strong attachment. So between that first meeting and this time, there is there's just pages and pages of doubt, confusion, despair. I mean, she's on her knees praying to God, what should I do? She's just torn. And part of this is because making this decision, when you're wanting to create a kind of a pious coupling, then it's not just your happiness here on earth. It could infect your happiness through in the afterlife as well. So it was very, very emotional for her to finally come under. So this is how I describe the stages of courtship. It's a new and unexpected scene, doubt, confusion, and despair, and then there's love. And again, it took them about 2.5 years. We all know that in some cases that can actually take place over a mere fraternity party. But for them, spoiler alert, they do get married. And as soon as before they even get married, they start negotiating what their shared calling is going to be. And in fact, in several occasions, they consider Burma. They consider following the Judsons to Burma, and which is really a perilous decision to make. And so some of her family's supportive, but mother especially does not think it's a good idea. And and Sally had some health problems before she got married. And so her mother writes to her and says, if your calling was to go to Burma, don't you think God would have given you more health and, wouldn't you have more soundness in body to be equal to the task? Later on in a letter, she just goes on and says, wouldn't the Baptists they'd be wasting their money sending you, because surely you would die there. And in fact, about 50% of those early missionaries did die in places like Burma and India and China and the rest. And this is a depiction of Ann Judson. Adoniram's in jail. Ann Judson has a 1-year-old child, and she actually sets up a tarp outside the jail and lives there for something like a year with the 1-year-old, so she can bring food to Adoniram every day and plead for his release. So it really was kind of this courageous, wild, extreme, romantic decision which is one of the reasons why their texts were read so voraciously, because it was very exciting. So they end up not going to Burma, and they actually considered mission to the Cherokees as well. They end up taking a church. Samuel takes a church in Sharon, Massachusetts, and Samuel writes to Sally, somebody must live in Sharon, poor and wicked as the town is. So clearly, to me, I think for them, their settling in Sharon was actually settling. they had more ambition. They wanted to make an important mark on the world with whatever mission they ended up with. So the other backdrop of what's going on here right now is that there is a real organized Baptist kind of power structure forming as a result of Anna and Adoniram's trip to Burma, or mission to Burma. The Baptists formed the Baptist Foreign Mission, the Board of Foreign Missions, to raise money to not only support the missionaries in Burma, but also support and send other missionaries to other places. They're following along the footsteps of the British Baptists. And then 3 years after they start this board, they decide in 1817 that they need to start a college to educate young men for the missions and ministry. And so this man, William Staunton, who is a Brit that's come over, he first starts a seminary in Philadelphia, and then after about a year, they move it to DC. So, and it becomes a college. And the idea, what they were hoping, was that it would become a National Baptist College. So, and it's called Columbian College, is actually the precursor to George Washington University. And so Samuel and Sally's two oldest brothers decide that they want to attend Columbian College. Columbian College is not set up to be able to accommodate wives. So both Samuel and Isaac, her older brother, they basically leave their wives in Brandon. They're actually living together, and they go down. They, with the other brother Jonathan, go to Columbian and begin studying. Samuel. I'm going to stop now too, and also say that Samuel. I believe that Samuel married up. He actually. I mentioned he comes from a more rural area. And also, if you compare the letters and the correspondence between the Wait family and the Merriam family, it's clear that the Merriam family is much better educated than the Wait family. And so Samuel felt the need to further his education if he was going to pursue a more ambitious calling. So he goes to Columbian, leaves her up in Vermont, and she's sad and she's jealous. Again, she's very smart. She can articulate pretty sophisticated theological concepts. In fact, there's a time when they're down there that her brother Jonathan writes her mother and says, "Hi, Mom. We were kind of all looking for that essay that Sally wrote on the divinity of Christ. Would you mind sending it down to us? And when you copy it, would you mind not putting her name on it?" So I don't know if they were planning to plagiarize it or not, but so Sally felt like she was going to be left behind intellectually, and it also, she's kind of left having to support the family because Samuel's down there not making a salary. And in New England, with the family farm economy, a lot of that is barter and trade. But when Samuel's down there, he needs cash, and cash is kind of hard to come by. So Sally teaches herself how to make leghorn bonnets, which is a very wildly popular bonnet at the time. Y'all have seen this in Jane Eyre movies. And so she was hoping to kind of keep along with Samuel on his studies, but she don't have any time to read all the books that he keeps recommending to her because she is making bonnets, and she's actually pretty darn good at it. And she starts to win some awards, and she's selling. One of her bonnets went for $100, which is a heck of a lot of money, or maybe it was $90. But and she starts to actually hire what she calls girls. That actually, this is a depiction of the women braiding the straw. It was a very tedious amount of work. And in the end, no matter what she actually ended up selling her bonnets for, it was hard to get help, and it was hard to make a living at it. And she later sets it aside, primarily because finally, after a couple of years, with them being separated, Samuel graduates and is able to be hired as a tutor at Columbian College, and therefore on a salary of $200 a year, he can bring her down. So, and Sally's a little worried about this too, because Sally is like very conscious of class and rank, so to speak. And so she wants to know, she writes to him, thinking, oh gosh, DC is going to, or Washington is going to be so fancy, and am I going to be okay? And Washington at this time was really pretty much a swamp. It was half finished, and there was, just mud between the Capitol and the White House. And so Samuel, assures her, don't worry, that, we're pretty plain in our appearance and our manners, so it'll be fine. However, contrary to that, there actually is there's like this new Baptist elite that is coming up in Washington city at the time, and which is kind of an oxymoron. The Baptists at this time generally are kind of scrappy guys, people, and so, but there becomes in DC this hub of power, and the Baptists realize that if we can get government to both help fund us, and also they really want Congress to call Columbian a national institution and fund it. So they began, they go to the White House. They go to President Monroe has his drawing rooms, which is what he calls his parties. They invite the president and both houses of Congress and all the heads of the department. The entire cabinet comes to Columbian for events. The Marquis de Lafayette is touring in the States, and he comes to an event at Columbian, and we actually have a table in our house called the Lafayette table, which is, family lore is that it was in the room when Lafayette walked by. And then this is Miriam Peel in the bottom. She's a famous and well-to-do artist, one of the first women artist portrait painters, and they're hanging out with them. So there really is this kind of Baptist elite that's growing up, that's creating this power structure that Sally finds herself in. Another thing that happens when they're in Washington City is that they have their first child, Annaliza Brewer. And this is a picture of her christening gown, which if you go to the Wake Forest Historical Museum, Ed or Sarah will pull it out and show it to you. So they start their family at that point in time as well. But there's another thing that's going on in terms of Sally's exposure in Washington City, and that's her exposure to slavery. So when Vermont is founded, slavery is against the law. So the servants, the girls that Sally employed at their house for helping with needle arts and helping with haying and helping with the braiding of hats and so on, were likely white girls from kind of disadvantaged families. But DC, where it is between the North and the South, becomes the hub of the domestic slave trade. So it's likely that when they went, when they were, College Hill was outside of the city, it's north of the White House, but near Kalorama, if you know DC now. But it's likely when they went into town, they would have seen the walls of the slave prisons. They very often, or very possibly, would have seen shackled, enslaved people. So this is Sally's first kind of introduction to this urban form of enslavement, and she would have experienced. There were enslaved people that were serving the faculty and the students on College Hill. They also made friends with a family called the Holmeads and went to their working plantation, and so they would have been exposed to slavery as well in DC. So there comes a time, as big as all the hopes of the leaders of the Columbian College are, it becomes pretty shortly after its founding, it's in dire straits financially. And so Samuel by this time has actually quit, and he is up back in New England. He's basically on a walkabout looking for a church to hire him. And then he gets a letter from the president of Columbian, Dr. Stoughton, saying that he's going on a mission, a fundraising mission down south, and can we hire you as an agent? Will you come with us and with me, and we'll raise money and save the college. So for those of you who are alums and know the origin story for Wake Forest, it's the story of, they're down there outside of New Bern. They're about to leave New Bern, and the horse of their carriage bucks, and the wagon crashes, and Dr. Staunton is injured, and it sidelines them in New Bern for a while. And as it happens, the church at New Bern doesn't have a Baptist minister right now, the Baptist church. And so they begin recruiting Samuel Wait immediately. And Samuel Wait pretty much falls in love with New Bern and begins to think that North Carolina, maybe it's North Carolina that is the place where our mission is. Sally's not so sure about this idea. And again, Sally kind of concerned about how, first of all, what New Bern is like, but also how do the members of the Baptist church rank with other members of other churches in regard to intelligence, which is important to her, and influence in society. But as it turns out, New Bern, New Bern had been the capital of North Carolina for some time, and it's a pretty happening place. It's a very busy port, North Carolina port. It apparently, if you read reports of the time, it was called the vortex of fashion. They described themselves as the Athens of North Carolina, with extravagance and fine dressing. So Samuel used all these kind of talking points through a series of letters to convince her to come down. And then in the meantime, the church members are showering him with gifts and gifts for Annaliza and gifts for Sally. So they do decide to come down, even if they're not sure it's going to be a permanent move. So at this time, they do decide to come down. And so now race and class in New Bern is different than it is in DC, and pretty interesting. It's 60% Black. There's a free and enslaved population. There are a number of entrepreneurs, African-American entrepreneurs that are working in town. There's a little neighborhood called Dryboro, which is right near where the Waits were living when they lived there, and that housed not only freed Blacks, but enslaved Blacks as well. Their owners would buy them houses to live in that area. The Presbyterian Church was founded by whites and Blacks. It was co-founded. Kitty and John Stanley. John Stanley was a freed Black who was a very successful entrepreneur, and his wife Kitty, I think he bought her freedom, and his wife Kitty was one of the founding members of the Presbyterian Church. And in fact, they sat in the main section in the pews because of their status. So it was a very biracial kind of integrated society. And in fact, Samuel's church, when he took it over, I think there were 13 white members and 8 African-American members, 3 of whom we believe were actually freed. So when Sally came down, there's evidence that they actually brought a white servant girl from Vermont with them. And by this time, of course, she had a small child, and so they brought, and she seems to be someone that Sally's mother knows, because Sally writes and asks about Dorotha pretty often, and asks, sends the respects. But by about a year and a half into their stay in New Bern, Dorotha seems to have kind of disappeared from the household, and we don't know why. It's possible if she was 16 at the time of going down there that she came of age and went back. There's evidence that she may have gone back. So, but at any rate, by November, Dorotha in 1829, Dorotha is missing, and indeed by 1830. Some 2 enslaved women do show up in their census. So the Merriam family had very strong objections to Sally and Samuel settling in the slaveholding South. This is actually her sister-in-law at a much later date. Her name was Asha, and as you can see, the middle quote in there is that, our strong and prevailing objection to the South is slavery. Slavery. Isaac, her older brother, was probably the most vocal about it. maybe other than her mother, and her mother, again, brought the souls of her children, before they settle into a land of slavery. So indeed, as I said, in the 1830 census, this census is taken about a month before they're about to leave to go. Sally's about to go back to New England. Samuel's about to go on the road to raise money for the fledgling North Carolina Baptist Convention, and two enslaved women show up in the federal census in the house that they are renting. It's very likely that they actually leased these enslaved women, which was very common at the time. However, by 1837 or 1838, the Waits do end up, when they're in the town of Wake Forest, purchasing two women primarily to help them run a boarding house that they open. So in 1830, Sally's back in New England. Samuel is around the back roads of North Carolina raising money for the Baptist. And Sally's just kind of tired. She's just tired of them being apart. And by this time they have a little boy named William Carey. And so you see Sally writes to Samuel and says, I just want us to have our own fireside, our own family altar. She says, William Carey begins to say a few words, ask him where his papa is, and he will reply, gone. And Annaliza says, tell Pa I want to see him and kiss him. And then she says, she very often dreams about you and wakes me to tell her your dream. So Sally's kind of tired. Samuel, is considering maybe, he thinks, well, maybe I should go back to New England, and we'll just buy a little farm, and then I'll preach on the side, and all become, come together again. But in the end, I think the call to North Carolina was too strong. So when Samuel writes this letter to Sally, what he doesn't know in January of 1831, it's mid-January, and he writes this letter. What he doesn't know, and what he can't know at this point, is that on January 1st of that year, their little boy, William Carey, has died. He took ill on a Christmas trip and fell and got worse pretty quickly. And Sally, you can see here, is talking about being, here she is. She's actually staying with his family, who she's not all that close to, and her sister has just passed away, her only sister, and her husband. The letter telling Samuel that the child has died doesn't make it to Samuel until I think April, because Samuel's all around the country, all around the back country, and the letter just keeps chasing him, and finally finds him in Raleigh at the second meeting of the North Carolina Baptist Convention. And she writes that, so he got sick, and she said at first his symptoms were not at all alarming, but then about 10 minutes before he breathed his last, he raised himself in the cradle and desired to be taken into my arms. I raised him into my lap. In a few minutes, his breath suddenly stopped. He gasped twice and expired. So very tragic feeling for Sally. And Samuel, of course, was crushed as well, but for Sally to be there. So in the same letter that Samuel had written in January, not knowing that his son had died, he says, I want to get back to a clear conscience, but how can I leave such a large field where the labors are so much wanted? He feels needed, and he feels like this is the calling. He says he wants to be within visiting distance of his parents, but North Carolina for distance is nothing to Burma. So he takes this moment as a plea to convince Sally that North Carolina is a place to them, to call back the sacrifice that Anne Hasseltine Judson and the example that Anne Hasseltine Judson had made in terms of sacrifice by going to Burma. And indeed, Anne Judson by this time has passed. She died a pretty sad death in Burma as well, along with her little child. So Sally, that seems to be enough to kind of call Sally back and convince her that it's the sacrifice that she should make too. So in 1832, the North Carolina Baptist Convention buys a former plantation, and Sally and Samuel establish the Wake Forest Manual Institute. And that is the backstory to the founding of Wake Forest University. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Mary. The quotes from that journal are incredible in those letters. So everyone, if you have any questions for Mary, we're going to shift to Q&A. So as I mentioned before, just type them into the Q&A box, the 2 chat bubbles, and then I'll share them with Mary. Let some populate in. I just thought it was incredible. The New Bern is the Athens of North Carolina. I had never heard that before.
You know, and if you've ever been there, it is a really absolutely charming town, but that's not what it conjures up for me when I think about it. So.
Go ahead, she can handle the questions. There we go. All right, from Anne. What happened to Annaliza? Oh, wonderful. Did she live a long life, have children?
Here's a picture of Annaliza with her husband, John Brewer. And yes, she did live a long life. She had 10 children. So she was the only child, the only surviving child. And so they had 10 children. So there are many, many, many cousins. Hallie Hearn is on this call. She's a descendant as well. And so they lived their life in the town of Wake Forest as well. And I see in the chat bar, Molly Lineberger asked pretty much the same question. So
okay, so the next question I'm very excited about. Do you have this from Reverend Dr. Laurie for Vancini? Excuse me. Do you have the Christology writing Sally's brothers requested?
No, and I'm crushed about that because I would love to. I mean, I'm actually convinced that they turned it in. One of them turned it in as his work at Columbian. I do have. So we do have in our possession. It's right down the hall. I should have brought it out. A small little what's called a commonplace book that Sally wrote in. It actually overlaps in time with her journal as well. And it's clearly, it seems to be assignments that are being given to her. So she writes an essay on greatness and then writes an essay on death and other things like that. And so that's where she's kind of working through some of her theology. So we do have some evidence of that. But no, I don't have. I think there are a lot of writings that she wrote that they could have been. I mean, one of the things we know, and Hallie can attest to this too, is that different things got passed down to different people, right? I mean, so there are cousins all over that have all kinds of different items, and so we have pieces in our family, and so there could be other writings out there somewhere.
That's a good transition to this next question from Elizabeth. Can you walk us through your journey from growing up with family stories about your ancestors to pursuing a master's degree to a book on the horizon? This is wonderful.
Oh, thanks, Elizabeth. It has been quite a journey. And, it's funny when my mother started doing this research, she really, at some points, she kept trying to kind of draw me in and say, hey, transcribe these letters for me and so on. And I was busy running a business. So I listened to the stories and I was interested in them, but it wasn't really until I got to Wake Forest that I had really any appreciation for it, because you come on campus and there's Whitechapel, and so her portrait is in the foyer there. I never would have guessed that this would be the path I would end up on, and there's a long, interesting story in how it actually became clear to me that this was kind of part of my calling to do this work as well. And it's been a fabulous experience with my mother as well, because she and I have shared this journey together, and that's been, I have no better cheerleader than my mom. So, there's this, I think a lot about the fact that I've got this, this little journal. I mean, I don't have it as a ZSR, but this little journal that Sally intentionally wrote for an imagined audience. And first of all, I think that every slip of paper that actually still survives is a tiny miracle. It's a miracle. These little fragile objects actually survive. But the fact that her great-great-great-granddaughter, so many generations later, finds the work and does the research. And, I worked really hard to try to understand her and not just approach her as, just some 19th century caricature that, just this pious woman. And, it took me a while to kind of peel back the onion and realize, oh, wait, this journal's got a story arc. This journal, when I figured out that it was a performative piece of work and not just a diary, that just blew my mind and opened everything up. So it feels pretty significant that I'm able to be a part of this. And Scott Danforth and Keith Harper are both on this call, and they're the editors of my book. And I am so happy to have them join me. And it's exciting.
I want to go to this one because you spoke a little bit about Sally's family's objections to moving to the South and their objections to slavery. And so I was just wondering, could you speak, I know you've gotten this question before, could you speak a little bit about Sally's views on slavery, what you know, what you don't know? Because Hallie asks, why do you think Sally accepted the purchase of slaves into her homes?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something I've worked really hard to try to understand. Sally doesn't ever write anything definitively like against slavery. She writes in almost coded terms about their concerns about living in North Carolina and what their daughter would be exposed to by having to live there. She did write about the enslaved people that work for them with a great deal of affection and, kind of that typical paternalistic kind of way that, the best way to describe it is that Sally does write about someday seeing their enslaved workers in heaven. So there was this rationalization from Christians, particularly in the South, who, by the time they got to the South, slavery had been a part of the economy for 200 years, right? So it was entrenched in the economy. And so I think there just became this rationalization that this is the plight of the Africans while they are here on this, evil earth, but that we will all transcend this. So they felt like their souls were worth saving. So they viewed them as people with souls, but they, there was this rationalization that they would move beyond it in the afterlife, but not here on earth. I'm also noticing some questions in the chat bar as well.
Yeah, some of them have popped over, but I'll get to that one in a second.
Okay.
Just real quick, how 2 questions that I think from Anne you can answer pretty quickly. How are you related to the Waits? And then the name Tribble is asked and what the campus building named after Tribble. Who is that? And could you explain a little bit? And then also Anne was wondering the book's publishing company.
Okay, awesome. Last one first is University of Tennessee Press. So I'm a direct descendant of Sally Wait. So it's Sally, Annaliza, let me see if I can get this right. Sally, Annaliza, Sally, KT, Lib, my mother bird, and me. So it's a matriarchal line all the way down. My mother went to Wake Forest, and while she was there at the original campus, she met a guy named Jim Tribble, who was the nephew of the president of the current, he was president of the university when they were there. So my mom's a descendant of the Waits, my dad's a descendant or related to the Tribbles, and they got married. And so I've got the line both ways. So Harold Tribble was president of the university at the time of the move to the new campus.
All right, I'm going to pop over to the chat real quick here. Edward and Pat were wondering, was the plantation you referenced in the town of Wake Forest near the college?
So Wake Forest was a plantation first. There was no town. So Wake Forest was the name of the plantation, and they bought that plantation. The owner, Calvin Jones, decided to move out west, as many people were doing during the early Republic. And so he moved his whole enterprise to Tennessee, and the Baptists bought the plantation and actually used the plantation buildings for the original campus. So the Calvin Jones house, which still stands, became the administration building as well as where the Waits lived. And actually the enslaved quarters became student housing. So it was 1838 before they began building the more permanent brick structures. So Wake Forest started as a plantation, and then a town grew up around it. Well, started as a plantation, became a college, and then a town grew up around it.
Piously says, great job. What steps did you take to understand the historical context? Did you run into elements that were difficult to substantiate, and how did you handle that?
Oh, those are great questions. My education through the Masters of Liberal Studies program was I knew hardly anything about the time frame of the early American Republic. And I started off my first class. I was lucky enough to get the last history of the Baptist class that Dr. Bill Leonard ever taught. And Dr. Leonard is a preeminent historian. So, because you can't understand the Waits without understanding Baptist history. So I started there, and then I took history of the early Republic in the history department with a professor named Jake Ruderman, who just taught me so much about the politics and the economy and just everything about that time period. And Jake actually ended up becoming my advisor. So so it was really all the classes I took that helped me with context. And did I hit I would hit some brick walls from time to time. When or if you ever read the book, you'll see, I try to kind of show my work. The Dortha piece of it, for instance, I mean, that was a lot of piecing together, and I am able to, with confidence, say there's good evidence that this is who this person is, but probably will never be able to be completely sure. And I don't know her story. I don't know where she ended up, right? So there are pieces that were sometimes hard to definitively prove, but it was that part of it was so much fun. I mean, I'd be up, at midnight in some 19th century Baptist document, and I'd find, a piece of something that helped pull it all together for me. And I'd text Jake or Jake Ruderman and so on. So yeah, so it was fun. It was kind of like a scavenger hunt. There's nothing more fun than finding something that you're looking for, that pulls pieces of information together for you.
Best feeling. All right, we have 1 minute left until 7 o'clock. So I'm going to let anyone who still has a question to ask, why don't you put it in the question and answer box, and then we can stick around and Mary's happy to answer them. But I just want to make a few quick announcements before I let you all go. So if you'll stay a little bit longer. As I said at the beginning, this week kicks off Wake Forest Virtual Homecoming, and we have several programs. We have lots of programs throughout the week, and you can find out all about them at homecoming.wfu.edu. But I'm going to just highlight 4 of them. On Wednesday at 7 p.m., Ronalda House Museum of American Art, ZSR Special Collections, and the Wake Forest Historical Museum are all partnering together to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And so we're going to be pulling artifacts from our collection that tell the history of Wake Forest College during World War II. So join us on Wednesday at 7 p.m. for that. On Thursday at 4 p.m., Dean Gillespie is going to host a book club with 3 other professors on Cast, The Origins of Our Discontent by Isabel Wilkerson. So join us then for at Thursday at 4 p.m. I'm signed up for that one. On Friday at 1 p.m., I'm also signed up for this one. You can join Jenny Robinson Puckett for a presentation titled Vintage Years and Deeks of Gold, followed by a chat with Dr. Ed Wilson. So that's Friday at 1 p.m. And then finally, on Sunday at 3 p.m., Jenny Puckett is going to come back and provide another presentation titled Boulders, Rocks, and Sand, the marvelously bumpy road of Wake Forest history during the Wake Forest College Birthplace Society's annual meeting. So if you're a Birthplace member, you want to learn more about the Birthplace Society, you can find all of that information on the Homecoming website. Any other questions here in the chat box? It looks like we have a few. Okay. Well, this is maybe a great question to end. Mary Beth asks, is there one thing that you really wish you could have found that you never could uncover? Do you still hope that you can find more information, or do you think you're done?
That's a great question. So yes, there's one thing. I mean, this is going to sound like just a tiny little, maybe insignificant fragment, but their son, William Carey, was named after a very famous British missionary named William Carey. And and people did that all the time, named people after famous people. I kept thinking Annaliza had to have been named after Hasseltine Judson. I mean, it just made sense to me. But I can't find anywhere that, what I was hoping was I could find some information that would say that had, that Anne Hasseltine was Annaliza Hasseltine. And so that I could prove that Annaliza had been named after her. And, that, again, it sounds so insignificant, but, it's just one of those things. I mean, they were so intentional about everything else they did. I think that Anne was definitely after Anne Hasseltine, but maybe Eliza was from someone else. I can't find her middle name anywhere. And yes, I still hope to uncover more. I have a friend who has studied actually it's one of the preachers from up in the Brandon area who Samuel first studied under, and he once gave a lecture about this guy he studied from. And a guy comes out of the audience and hands him a handwritten book that this minister had read. And so I just have this dream that someday I'll do a talk and somebody will show up with the first journal from Sally Wait or something like that. So yeah, it's, I really haven't done a lot of too much work as Sally's life going forward, from while Wake Forest was started. So I'd probably go forward some into the future as well.
I find that quite fascinating. All right. Well, I think that will conclude our program tonight. Mary, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I've heard bits and pieces of your presentation over the last year and a half, and I'm so excited. I was so glad to hear it all here and see those wonderful, oh man, Sally's writing is just amazing. It's just incredible. All right, everyone, have a wonderful evening. Enjoy the rest of the homecoming week activities, and just stay well.
Yeah, thank you all. It was so much fun. It's so nice to see so many of my friends from school here. Thank you all.